Alexei Petrov was once a powerful oligarch, deeply connected to the Kremlin's elite. But in 2018, his life took a terrifying turn when he narrowly survived a suspected assassination attempt. Emerging from a near-death experience, Petrov became a fearless critic of Vladimir Putin's regime, revealing dark secrets about Russia's shadowy political machine. His story is one of immense power, betrayal, and a chilling vision he claims to have seen in the moments between life and death. A warning from Putin himself that he now feels compelled to share with the world. Born into the shadows of Soviet Russia, Alexei Petrov's early years were marked by hardship and resilience. He grew up in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, part of a working-class family that felt the strain of the crumbling Soviet system. His father was a factory worker, tough and stern, with hands roughened by decades of labor. His mother, a schoolteacher, was the family's guiding light, instilling in her children a sense of ambition and the importance of education, even as the Soviet Union began to falter. From a young age, Petrov displayed an unusual drive. While his peers were content with the predictability of Soviet life, Alexei always sought something more. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet economy teetered on the brink of collapse, Petrov saw opportunity where others saw despair. He studied economics at Moscow State University, and it was here that he first glimpsed the cracks in the Soviet monolith. The lectures were filled with party-approved rhetoric, but Petrov noticed a growing disconnect between the theory and the reality unfolding outside the classroom walls. He was restless, eager to make his mark in a changing world. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 ushered in a period of chaos and uncertainty. For many, it was a time of loss and disorientation, but for the young and ambitious, it was a moment ripe with potential. Petrov quickly grasped the magnitude of the transformation sweeping through the country. The old system had crumbled, leaving a vacuum where rigid Soviet bureaucracy once ruled. He understood that whoever could fill this vacuum with new enterprises and ideas would wield immense power. Petrov's first ventures were modest by today's standards, but groundbreaking at the time. He started as a trader, importing Western goods that had been unavailable during the Soviet era. Simple items like electronics, clothing, and luxury food products were suddenly in high demand, and Petrov knew how to meet it. He scoured the remnants of Soviet infrastructure, finding underused transportation networks and securing distribution channels that others overlooked. He was resourceful, often using barter systems and negotiating with factory managers desperate for supplies. These early successes caught the attention of more seasoned businessmen, and Petrov found himself at the center of Moscow's burgeoning entrepreneurial scene. He partnered with former Soviet officials who had pivoted to business, leveraging their connections to gain access to lucrative deals. By the mid-1990s, as the Russian economy lurched into wild capitalism, Petrov had made his first $1 million, a remarkable achievement given the instability of the time. However, the real turning point in Petrov's career came with the privatization wave that swept through Russia in the mid-1990s. Under Boris Yeltsin's administration, state-owned enterprises were being sold off at bargain prices, ostensibly to transition Russia into a free market economy. In reality, the process was chaotic, rife with corruption and insider deals. Petrov, now well-connected, saw this as the chance of a lifetime. He quickly moved to acquire shares in energy companies, taking advantage of the infamous loans for shares scheme, which allowed a small group of businessmen to gain control of Russia's vast natural resources for a fraction of their worth. It was during this period that Petrov's relationship with Vladimir Putin began to take shape. In the early 1990s, Putin was a relatively unknown figure, working as a low-level official in the mayor's office of St. Petersburg. He was not yet the imposing leader he would later become, but he had already demonstrated a talent for navigating the murky waters of Russian politics. Petrov met Putin at a dinner organized by a mutual acquaintance, a well-known banker who saw the potential for collaboration between the rising businessman and the ambitious bureaucrat. Their first interactions were cordial but cautious. Petrov was impressed by Putin's strategic mind and his understanding of power dynamics. He noticed that while Putin was outwardly polite and measured, there was a cold, calculating edge to him, a trait that Petrov respected. They quickly formed a symbiotic relationship. Petrov provided financial support for local projects in St. Petersburg, and in return, he received protection and access to lucrative contracts. It was a typical arrangement in the chaotic 1990s, where business and politics were inextricably linked, often in ways that blurred the lines of legality. By the time Putin ascended to the presidency in 1999, Petrov had become a wealthy and influential oligarch with holdings in energy, media, and real estate. He was part of the inner circle of businessmen who had backed Putin's rise, a group often referred to as the family. Petrov's influence extended far beyond Moscow. He had ties to Western investors and was seen as a bridge between Russian capital and international markets. He was at the height of his power, a kingmaker who had helped install a new president. In the early 2000s, Petrov enjoyed unparalleled access to the Kremlin. He attended private dinners with Putin and his top advisors, and he was a regular guest at state events. He saw firsthand the transformation of Putin from a pragmatic, seemingly apolitical figure into a leader with a clear vision for a new, more centralized Russia. Petrov initially supported this shift, believing that a strong hand was needed to stabilize the country after the lawlessness of the Yeltsin years. He was, after all, a beneficiary of the new order. However, as the years passed, Petrov began to notice a change. The Kremlin's policies became more authoritarian, and Putin's demeanor grew colder, more detached. He began to sideline the very oligarchs who had supported him, stripping them of their assets and, in some cases, imprisoning them. Petrov watched as Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia, was arrested and sent to a Siberian prison colony. It was a chilling message. No one was untouchable. Petrov knew that his own empire, built on the volatile foundation of Russian politics, was vulnerable. He had played the game well, but the rules were changing. The Kremlin was no longer content with simply receiving a cut of the profits. It wanted control. Petrov's assets were scrutinized, his business dealings questioned. He found himself increasingly at odds with Putin's administration, especially as he began to voice concerns about the growing authoritarianism and corruption he witnessed. By 2015, Petrov's relationship with the Kremlin had soured. He had become a vocal critic of the regime, albeit carefully at first, speaking in veiled terms during interviews and private meetings. He warned of the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of one man, hinting at the corruption and cronyism that had taken hold under Putin's rule. The Kremlin, once his protector, now viewed him with suspicion. The whispers of discontent among Russia's elite grew louder, and Petrov found himself increasingly isolated. The tension reached a boiling point in early 2018. Petrov had become too outspoken, too critical of the regime. He received cryptic messages, warnings from old friends who advised him to keep a low profile. His phone was tapped, his movements tracked. It was clear that the Kremlin had turned against him, and Petrov knew what that meant. He had seen what happened to those who crossed Putin, businessmen who once wielded immense power, reduced to nothing or worse. But Petrov was not the type to back down. He had built his empire through sheer force of will, and he wasn't about to be cowed by threats. He continued speaking out, even as the noose tightened around him. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he believed he had no other choice. For Petrov, it was a matter of principle. He had seen the dark side of power, and he could no longer stay silent. The dinner had been unremarkable at first. Petrov was seated at a private table in one of St. Petersburg's most exclusive restaurants, enjoying a meal with a small group of close associates. They were discussing business, an upcoming investment deal in Eastern Europe, the volatile oil market, and the ever-present spectre of new government regulations. Petrov was in good spirits, confident and animated as he discussed plans for the future. He ordered a bottle of his favorite wine, a vintage Bordeaux, and laughed as he raised a toast to new opportunities. But as the night wore on, something shifted. Petrov's demeanor changed. He grew quiet and pensive, his face suddenly pale. He rubbed his temples as if trying to dispel a headache. His friends noticed his discomfort, asking if he was feeling unwell, but Petrov waved them off, forcing a smile. He excused himself and walked towards the bathroom, his steps unsteady. He felt a wave of nausea hit him, stronger than anything he had ever experienced. The room spun around him, and he clutched the edge of the sink, looking at his reflection in the mirror. His skin was ashen, his pupils dilated. Panic surged through him. This wasn't a normal illness. He knew, deep down, what was happening. He had heard stories whispered in the corridors of power of others who had fallen suddenly ill, their lives ending in a spiral of unexplained symptoms. Petrov stumbled back to the table, clutching his stomach. His companions rose in alarm as he collapsed into his chair, gasping for breath. He felt a searing pain spread through his body, like fire coursing through his veins. The sensation was terrifying, a creeping paralysis that left him unable to speak. He tried to call for help, but his voice was a strangled whisper. His vision blurred, the faces around him becoming indistinct shapes. In the back of his mind, he realized what this meant. He had been poisoned. Chaos erupted in the restaurant. Waiters rushed over, and one of Petrov's associates called an ambulance. Within minutes, he was being carried out of the restaurant on a stretcher, his body convulsing, foam forming at the corners of his mouth. The paramedics worked frantically, administering oxygen and checking his vitals. One of them noted the rapid decline in his heart rate and the unusual constriction of his pupils. They exchanged a look, understanding without words that they were dealing with something far more sinister than food poisoning. At the hospital, Petrov was rushed into intensive care. Doctors fought to stabilize him, running a battery of tests. His symptoms were perplexing and severe: uncontrollable muscle spasms, difficulty breathing, and a dangerously low heart rate. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and within hours, he slipped into a coma. The toxicologists were baffled. Initial blood tests showed no common toxins, no traces of alcohol or drugs. It was as if his body had been attacked by something invisible, something unknown. It took days before they identified the culprit, a rare nerve agent, similar to those used in previous high-profile assassinations linked to Russian intelligence. The revelation was shocking, but not surprising. In the world of Russian politics, poisoning had long been a favored method of silencing critics. The nerve agent, designed to disrupt the nervous system, was almost undetectable and left few traces. It was a signature move, a message meant to be clear to those who understood the language of power. No one defies the Kremlin and lives to tell the tale. While Petrov lay unconscious, his body a battleground between life and death, the media caught wind of the story. Rumors spread quickly. An oligarch had been poisoned in what seemed like a targeted attack. International news outlets picked up the story, drawing comparisons to the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London and the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. The Kremlin, as expected, denied any involvement, dismissing the incident as a tragic case of food poisoning or an adverse reaction to medication. But for those familiar with the tactics of the Russian state, the truth was unmistakable. Petrov's family was kept in the dark, left waiting in the sterile hospital corridors with no answers. His wife, Irina, was visibly distraught, clutching the hands of their 2 teenage daughters who struggled to comprehend what was happening to their father. Doctors warned her that the prognosis was bleak. Even if he survived, there was a high chance of permanent neurological damage. The nerve agent had ravaged his body, leaving his organs struggling to function. For 2 weeks, Petrov remained in a coma. He teetered on the edge of death, his vital signs fluctuating unpredictably. It was during this time that he would later claim to have experienced a vision, a near-death experience that changed his outlook on everything, including his understanding of Vladimir Putin's power. The vision was disturbing, vivid, and unlike anything he had ever imagined. When Petrov finally awoke, he was weak and disoriented. It took several days before he could speak coherently. His first words were not of relief or gratitude. They were a question whispered hoarsely to his wife. "Did they try to kill me?" Irina nodded, her face etched with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Petrov closed his eyes, a wave of cold realization washing over him. He had come closer to death than he ever thought possible, and he knew exactly who was responsible. His recovery was slow and painful. He struggled with partial paralysis in his right arm, the lingering effects of the nerve agent. He required weeks of physical therapy just to regain the strength to walk unassisted. During this time, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would no longer stay silent. He could have died in that hospital bed, another victim of the Kremlin's shadowy war against dissent. But he had survived, and now he felt it was his duty to speak out. Petrov's first public appearance after the poisoning was a subdued affair. He was still visibly weakened, his voice softer and slower than before, but his message was clear. He spoke to a group of Western journalists in a private meeting room of a European hotel. The atmosphere was tense, the room filled with the quiet clicking of cameras and the scribbling of notes. Petrov leaned forward, his eyes hollow but determined, and began to tell his story. He recounted the events leading up to the poisoning, the threats he had received, the surveillance he had noticed. He described the dinner, the sudden onset of symptoms, and the terror of realizing he had been poisoned. He spoke in detail about the hospital, the coma, and the excruciating recovery process. But what stunned the room into silence was what came next. Petrov's account of his vision during the coma. He described the dark, cold hallway, the feeling of being trapped in the depths of the Kremlin. He recounted seeing Vladimir Putin, not as a man, but as a shadowy figure, a manifestation of Russia's dark, authoritarian past. He described the throne of broken clocks and the message he felt conveyed to him without words. "I am the past, present, and future of Russia. Petrov's voice broke as he spoke, not out of fear, but out of the weight of the realization he had come to. He believed he had glimpsed the true nature of Putin's power, a force that went beyond politics, something more profound and insidious. Petrov's account was met with a mixture of shock and skepticism. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of a man traumatized by a near-fatal experience. Others, however, felt the chilling truth in his words. The vision, whether real or a hallucination, was a potent metaphor for the reality of Putin's rule. A vision of a leader who had entwined himself so deeply with the Russian state that he had become its very essence. In the days that followed, Petrov continued to speak out. He granted interviews to Western media, his face a constant presence on news channels. He accused the Kremlin of corruption, of running the country like a mafia state, where dissent was met with violence and fear. He named names, pointing fingers at high-ranking officials who had become wealthy through their connections to Putin. He was fearless, almost reckless in his denunciations. The backlash was immediate. Russian state media launched a smear campaign, painting Petrov as a disgruntled oligarch whose business ventures had failed, a man desperate for attention. They accused him of fabricating the poisoning, of being a pawn of the West in a broader campaign to discredit Russia. Petrov, however, remained undeterred. He knew the risks of speaking out, but he also knew that silence was no longer an option. For Petrov, the decision to go public was not just an act of defiance, it was an act of survival. He understood that his best chance of staying alive was to make his story as public as possible. The more people knew, the harder it would be for the Kremlin to make him disappear quietly. He had become a marked man, but he embraced it. In his mind, he had already faced death once, and it had changed him irrevocably. He no longer feared what the Kremlin might do. Instead, he feared the consequences of remaining silent. Fleeing Russia was not a decision Alexei Petrov made lightly. He knew what it meant to leave behind the empire he had built, the home where his children grew up, and the life of privilege and power he had enjoyed for decades. But after the poisoning attempt, it was clear to him that he had no choice. He had crossed an invisible line, becoming a liability to the Kremlin rather than an asset. The whispers of old friends, the advice of those who had gone into exile before him. Everything pointed in one direction. He had to leave, and he had to leave quickly. The logistics of his escape were complex, planned with the precision of a covert operation. Petrov couldn't rely on commercial flights. His name was too well known, his movements too easily tracked. Instead, he made arrangements through a network of trusted contacts, business associates in Europe who had their own reasons to fear the Kremlin's reach. He left in the dead of night, traveling under a false identity. It was a far cry from the luxury he was accustomed to. He was smuggled out like a fugitive, escorted by former military personnel who specialized in high-risk extractions. They avoided major airports, taking small private planes, moving through obscure border crossings. Each leg of the journey was shrouded in secrecy, and Petrov's family was kept in the dark until he had safely arrived in a Western European country. Petrov's destination was a closely guarded secret. Even his closest allies didn't know where he had gone. He had learned from the mistakes of others who had sought refuge in Europe, only to be tracked down by Russian operatives. He chose a country with no extradition treaty with Russia, a place where the government was sympathetic to critics of the Kremlin. He set up his new life in a secluded estate, guarded round the clock by private security. The house was wired with surveillance cameras, and every visitor was vetted thoroughly. Petrov had seen too many of his peers hunted down in foreign lands. He knew that the Kremlin's reach extended far beyond Russia's borders. Life in exile was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, he was finally free to speak without the immediate threat of retaliation. But on the other hand, he was isolated, cut off from the world he once dominated. He watched the news obsessively, following the developments in Russia, reading between the lines of state-controlled media, and analyzing the latest moves from the Kremlin. It was a strange existence for a man who had once been at the heart of Russian power. He was now an outsider, an observer, a commentator. But Petrov was not content to simply fade away into the safety of anonymity. He knew that his voice still held weight, that he could make a difference by speaking out. He started writing essays and opinion pieces, publishing them in major Western newspapers and online platforms. In these pieces, he laid bare the inner workings of the Kremlin, exposing the corruption and manipulation he had witnessed firsthand. He spoke of the deals made behind closed doors, the oligarchs who paid for their wealth with loyalty, and the brutal tactics used to silence dissent. His words were scathing, filled with a bitterness that had been growing since the poisoning. The response was immediate. Petrov became a darling of the Western media, portrayed as a brave whistleblower who had turned against the very system that had made him rich. He gave interviews on major news channels. His face, a familiar presence on television screens across Europe and the United States. He was asked about everything, from his relationship with Putin to the details of his poisoning. He answered carefully, revealing enough to keep his story compelling, but withholding certain details that he knew could endanger those still inside Russia. Despite the attention, Petrov's life in exile was far from glamorous. He was plagued by paranoia, a constant fear that he had not escaped far enough. He changed his phone numbers regularly, used encrypted messaging apps, and avoided public places whenever possible. His security detail was vigilant, but Petrov knew that even the best precautions could fail. He remembered the stories of other defectors, former KGB agents who had died mysteriously, journalists who had been shot or poisoned in what were officially labeled as accidents. He understood that the Kremlin would not forget him, and that as long as he continued to speak out, he would remain a target. Petrov's family struggled to adjust to their new life. His wife, Irina, was a shadow of her former self, haunted by the fear that had gripped her since the poisoning. Their daughters, who had been raised in luxury, found themselves isolated and unable to trust anyone outside their immediate circle. Petrov tried to reassure them, but he knew that his words rang hollow. He had chosen this path for all of them, and they were paying the price for his defiance. As the months passed, Petrov's writing became sharper, more focused. He had moved beyond recounting his own story to making broader critiques of the Russian state. He wrote about the systemic corruption that had taken root under Putin, the ways in which the state manipulated the media to control public perception, and the culture of fear that permeated every level of Russian society. He argued that Putin's rule was not merely autocratic. It was a return to a darker, more paranoid era of Russian history, reminiscent of Stalin's purges and the KGB's reign of terror. These essays struck a chord in the West, where the image of Russia as a mafia state was gaining traction. Politicians cited Petrov's writings as evidence in debates over sanctions and foreign policy. He became a sought-after speaker at conferences on international relations, his name invoked as an authority on the inner workings of the Kremlin. Petrov, however, took no pleasure in this newfound status. He knew that every word he spoke brought him closer to another attempt on his life. It was during one of these speaking engagements that Petrov shared, for the first time publicly, the full details of the vision he had experienced during his near-death experience. The room fell silent as he recounted the dreamlike sequence, the feeling of being trapped in the stone corridors of the Kremlin, the cold, echoing whispers of unseen figures, and the dark figure of Putin on his throne of broken clocks. He described the sensation of timelessness, the impression that he had been shown something beyond the physical realm, a glimpse into the soul of Russia itself, intertwined with its leader in a way that was both symbolic and terrifyingly real. Petrov explained that the vision had altered his understanding of Putin's power. It was not merely political or economic, it was something deeper, almost metaphysical. He spoke of Putin as a manifestation of Russia's darker impulses, a figure who had emerged from the country's history of authoritarian rule like a shadow rising from a long-forgotten grave. Petrov's voice trembled as he spoke, but there was a clarity to his words that resonated with the audience. He was not simply recounting a hallucination. He was describing a profound realization, one that had changed the way he viewed not just Putin, but the entire Russian state. The reaction to his speech was mixed. Some listeners were captivated, feeling that they had been given a rare insight into the psyche of the Russian elite. Others dismissed it as the fevered imagination of a man traumatized by his near-death experience. But for Petrov, it didn't matter. He had told the truth as he understood it, and he felt a sense of relief in having shared it. The vision had haunted him for months, lingering in the back of his mind like a dark cloud. Speaking it aloud was his way of exorcising the fear that had taken root in his heart. Despite the catharsis of sharing his vision, Petrov knew that it had also put him in even greater danger. He had exposed not just the corruption of the Kremlin, but something deeper, an idea that Putin's power was more than political, that it was a manifestation of something far older and darker in Russia's history. He had dared to suggest that Putin was not just a man, but a symbol of the nation's most repressive tendencies. It was a bold and dangerous assertion, one that the Kremlin could not easily ignore. In the weeks following the speech, Petrov noticed an increase in suspicious activity around him. His security team reported unfamiliar cars parked near his home, and he received cryptic emails that seemed designed to unsettle him. Friends in the intelligence community warned him to be careful, to consider scaling back his public appearances. But Petrov refused. He knew that the moment he allowed fear to silence him, he would have lost. He had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. Petrov's life remains a precarious balancing act, a constant dance with danger. He continues to live in exile, separated from his homeland, speaking out against a regime that has marked him for death. He knows that he may not survive another attempt on his life, but he remains defiant. In his last interview, he summed up his philosophy in a single sentence: "I would rather die telling the truth than live in fear of it." Just weeks later, the tragic news came from Sofia, Bulgaria. Petrov was shot dead in broad daylight, outside a cafe in the heart of the city. Witnesses described a swift professional hit. 2 gunmen approached him as he sat at an outdoor table, sipping coffee. 3 shots were fired, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. The assassins fled the scene within seconds, disappearing into the crowded streets before the authorities could respond. It was a bold, brutal execution, carried out in a manner that left no room for ambiguity. The investigation into his murder was slow and riddled with complications. Local police cited a lack of evidence, and the Bulgarian government remained tight-lipped, wary of escalating tensions with Moscow. However, intelligence sources in the West pointed the finger squarely at Russian operatives, suggesting the involvement of state-sponsored assassins. It was a method Petrov had anticipated, a final, undeniable message from the Kremlin that his defiance would not be tolerated. The assassination of Alexei Petrov sent shockwaves through the international community. World leaders condemned the killing, and tributes poured in from journalists, activists, and politicians who had admired his courage. In Russia, however, state media barely acknowledged his death, dismissing it as a consequence of his reckless behavior abroad. The Kremlin maintained its characteristic silence, an implicit acknowledgement that needed no words. Yet, in death, Petrov's message only grew louder. His final writings, published posthumously, painted a stark portrait of a Russia gripped by fear, haunted by its past, and held captive by a leader who had become more than just a man, a symbol of a nation's darkest impulses. In the end, Alexei Petrov may have lost his life, but he achieved something more powerful. He left behind a story that could not be buried, a legacy of truth that would continue to challenge those in power long after his voice was silenced. And with that, Alexei Petrov's story came to a brutal, tragic end. A tale of a man who, despite everything, chose defiance over silence, knowing full well the price he would pay.